Family erased me from my sister's wedding, yet I returned wearing 4 stars. They couldn't deny Jenna, my younger sister by 3 years, had always been the family's favorite, the golden child. She had the bright smile, the traditional path, the Pinterest perfect life. My mother doted on her, my father spoiled her, and my aunts and uncles compared everyone else to her. Including me. I never resented her for it, not at first. But things shifted when I took a path none of them understood. Why would choosing a career in the military create such a chasm between us? When I joined the Air Force straight out of college, my family called it a phase. My mother said I'd grow tired of rough living, and my father just grunted, disappointed that I hadn't chosen law school. Jenna, back then, had hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes, but her words still echoed like condescension. Be safe, Lena. And come back when you're ready to settle down. What did that even mean, settle down? And why did no one ever ask why I chose this path? Years passed. I flew missions, led teams, served in active zones, earned commendations. But my family never attended a single promotion ceremony. They missed them all with polite excuses. Too far. Jenna's recital is that weekend. We'll see pictures online. It hurt, but I buried that pain deep. Until Jenna got engaged, and suddenly, I saw exactly how much space I took up in their world. None. I found out about the wedding through a cousin's Facebook post. No direct call. No save the date. No bridal shower invite. At first, I told myself it must be a mistake. Surely, Jenna just forgot to text me in the chaos. But then I saw the group photo, mom, dad, my aunts, even cousins from out of state, smiling beside Jenna in matching robes at her bridal shower. My name wasn't even mentioned in the captions. That's when I realized it wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Why would a sister go to such lengths to erase me? I called Jenna, my hands trembling. She didn't answer. She texted an hour later, didn't think you'd want to come. It's not your scene. Plus, with your schedule, we figured, she figured. Just like that, I replied with a single sentence. Congratulations. I won't forget this. And I didn't, but they were about to remember me, in a way they never expected. 3 months after that message, I was deployed overseas. I won't go into mission details. Some parts of my job still can't be discussed publicly. But what I can tell you is that I led a team through one of the most critical joint operations in that region in over a decade. It was dangerous, high stakes. Lives hung in the balance, and we succeeded. What followed was a series of recognitions I never sought, but deeply honored. Why is it that strangers saluted me, but my own family never even said a "we're proud"? I was awarded my 4th star 6 months after that mission. It came with a ceremony, one I expected to attend alone. But my commanding officer asked if I had any family I'd like to invite them. Why answer? No. My family's not in my life. He didn't pry, just nodded. But something about saying it aloud made the finality sink in. They were alive, but they weren't with me. Not really. And yet, the irony? They were about to be. The wedding photos from Jenna's big day eventually surfaced. I saw them accidentally while scrolling online. My mother had tagged herself in an album. There they were, all beaming at the country club venue. Matching dresses, coordinated poses, and custom signage with JNN forever. Not a single mention of the sister in uniform, but the timing was poetic. Because a month later, the local Veterans Gala was being held in our hometown. And I had been asked to attend as a guest of honor. Can you guess who else was there? The gala was hosted at the very venue Jenna had used for her wedding. It was the place to hold grand events in our town. And wouldn't you know, it was Jenna's new in-laws who were on the planning committee, which meant they were attending. Along with Jenna, and mom, and dad. They had no idea I was going to be there, not just as a guest, but as the keynote speaker. I arrived in full dress uniform. My ribbons and medals are meticulously placed. My 4 stars gleaming under the chandeliers. Heads turned as I entered. Salutes followed. For a moment, I felt 10 feet tall, not out of arrogance, but because I had stood alone in so many storms and was finally seen for it. Then I saw them. Jenna, my mother, my father, frozen at their table, mouth slightly agape, and, just like that, the silence between us shattered. Jenna was the first to stand, her eyes darting to my uniform, then to the program brochure. You're speaking? She stammered. I nodded calmly. Yes. They asked me to share about the mission last year. Mom's eyes were watery. Dad cleared his throat. But no one said, I'm sorry. No one said, we were wrong. Still, their faces said enough, but the moment of truth hadn't even come yet, because what I said on that stage would haunt them more than anything. When it was my turn to speak, I took the microphone and faced a room filled with strangers who somehow felt more like family than my blood ever had to. I shared my story, not the pain, not the betrayal, but the resilience. The pride. The purpose. I spoke about service, sacrifice, and what it meant to be invisible in your own home yet indispensable to your country, and I ended with this: sometimes, the people closest to you won't see your worth, until the world forces them to. And that's okay. Because we don't wear these uniforms for applause. We wear them because we believe in something bigger. Even when others don't believe in us. The applause that followed? That wasn't for revenge. It was for redemption. After the event, Jenna approached me quietly. I didn't think you'd want to be part of my life anymore, she said. I looked her in the eye. You never asked. She nodded, shame washing over her face. You were always stronger than me. For the first time in years, she wasn't performing. She was real. And so was the regret, but forgiveness doesn't arrive all at once. It starts with truth. We talked that night, more than we had in 5 years. She apologized, finally, for cutting me out. She admitted Mom had said Elena probably wouldn't fit in with the bridesmaids. That it would be awkward. That I was too military. But that night, I wasn't too much of anything. What I was the person that the entire room had stood for, and for once, Jenna saw me the way I always wished she would. Would it change everything? Asterisk that remains to be seen. Relationships, especially fractured ones, don't heal in a single conversation. My parents have since reached out, slowly, awkwardly, with hesitant texts and lukewarm attempts, but I'm not holding my breath for perfection. I've learned to live without their applause, because of the stars I wear. They're not for them. They're for every girl who was told she didn't belong. Every daughter was erased from the story until she rewrote it herself, and I'm still writing mine. The days after the gala were strange. A part of me wanted to go back to base and close that chapter forever, leave my hometown in the rearview mirror like a battlefield I'd already survived. But something inside me hesitated. Not because I needed closure from them, but because, for once, I had nothing to hide, and maybe they finally had to see what they had tried so hard not to. Jenna texted the day after the gala. Can we talk? Just us? We met at a small cafe in town where we used to eat pancakes as kids. She wore a simple blouse, no filters, no curated poses. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe more excuses. Maybe guilt. But she surprised me. You were always the brave one, Elena, she said, stirring her coffee slowly. And I was always trying to keep things pretty, polished. But I made everything worse. It was the first time she admitted the roles we played weren't equal. And that acknowledgement mattered more than I expected. I didn't think you'd say yes to the wedding even if we invited you, she said. I raised an eyebrow. So you didn't invite me to protect yourself from being rejected? She sighed. Maybe. But also because Mom said you'd make people uncomfortable in uniform. That it wasn't the vibe of the event. I felt the sting again, but this time I didn't flinch. I looked her dead in the eye. You think combat made me hard, Jenna? You have no idea how sharp silence cuts. She blinked rapidly, holding back tears. But I needed her to hear it. Asterisk. She reached across the table and gripped my hand. I can't change what happened, she whispered. But I want my kids to know their aunt. The real one. That word, aunt, stirred something in me I wasn't ready for. I'd never considered my role in Jenna's picture-perfect life. I'd been erased from the photo albums, the family holidays, the big celebrations, but now, she was asking me to step into a role that could never be denied, one no one else could. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, was this healing, or a new performance? Later that week, I got a call from my father. The last time he and I spoke, he criticized my choice to serve, calling it a waste of a smart girl's potential. Now, his voice was quieter. Unsure. I saw your speech, he said. I watched the recording 3 times. I didn't say anything, waiting for but instead, he added, I was wrong. I didn't understand what you were doing out there. I thought, maybe you were trying to escape us. I almost laughed. I wasn't escaping you, Dad. I was becoming someone I could live with. His silence told me he finally understood. My mother, on the other hand, was a different story. She sent a long email, too long to be sincere, too polished to be raw. It read like a PR apology. Something about misunderstanding me, fearing for my safety, not wanting to put pressure on me during her daughter's special day. She ended with, we are so proud of what you've accomplished, Elena. Funny how pride only showed up when the world had already stood and clapped. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because pride that comes with conditions isn't pride, it's performance. And I wasn't auditioning anymore. Weeks passed. I returned to base, resumed my duties, and led my team through another major training exercise. I was back in my element, efficient, focused, respected, but something lingered. A soft hum of possibility. What if reconnecting is possible? Not just with my family, but with the part of me I buried to survive their rejection. So I did something. Bolt. I invited Jenna and her husband to visit the base. I expected her to politely decline. She didn't. When she and Nate arrived, they looked out of place, she in flats and a floral dress, nervously adjusting his collar, but the moment they stepped onto the flight line, something shifted. They saw the salutes. The difference in the scale of responsibility I carried. I introduced them to my team. Jenna shook hands like someone waking up in a new world. This is not what I pictured, she said quietly. What did you picture? I asked. She looked down. Someone is angry, rigid, lonely. And then I smiled funny. That's what I thought about you. That weekend changed something between us. It wasn't instant forgiveness, but it was the start of recognition. Jenna asked questions about my missions, not the gory ones, but the human parts. Do you ever get scared? She asked one evening. I looked out at the horizon. Every time. But not for me. For my people. For what we carry. She nodded slowly, then whispered, you always carried us, too. Even when we didn't deserve it. And for the first time, I believed she meant it. Months passed. I didn't rush to fix the broken parts of our family. I let them come to me. Slowly. Tentatively. I met my niece when she was born. Held her in my arms and whispered stories of women who were called too much, until the world realized they were never enough. Jenna asked me to be her godmother. This time, I was invited. No hesitation. No excuses, and standing there in the church, in a simple blue dress, not a uniform, I still wore the strength I earned. And no one could deny it. The true victory wasn't the applause at the gala. It wasn't the medals or the stars. It was this moment, holding a child who would grow up knowing that her aunt was a warrior. That dignity isn't loud. That being left out doesn't mean you stay gone, because sometimes, you return, not with vengeance, but with valor, and for stars, they can never take away it. There's a funny thing about healing, it's not loud. It doesn't arrive like a parade. It tiptoes into your life in tiny, almost invisible moments. You wake up one morning and realize you don't wince when you see their names pop up on your phone. You hear an old memory and feel warmth instead of heat. For me, healing didn't mean forgetting the wedding I was erased from. It meant realizing I didn't need to be there to prove I belonged, and yet, fate has a way of circling back, offering us strange chances to rewrite the chapters we never got to finish. A year after that gala, Jenna invited me to her daughter's first birthday party. It was the first full family event I'd been attending since I was ghosted from her wedding. I hesitated. Not out of fear, but caution. I wasn't sure who they'd expect to show up, the woman in uniform, the quiet daughter, or the soldier. They still didn't fully understand, but I said yes, and this time, I walked in through the front door. No surprises, no accidental encounters. Just me, Elena, fully present and unapologetically whole. The moment I walked into that house, every eye turned to me. Not out of judgment this time, but curiosity. My aunts whispered. My cousins smiled nervously, and my father, he stood up. Welcome home, Captain, he said. Not sarcastic. Not reluctant, respectful. That I didn't respond with a salute. I didn't have to. My presence was enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was all I had ever wanted. But what followed next took me by surprise. Why? Mother approached me, slowly, almost timidly. She held a small, gift-wrapped box in her hands. I kept something, she said, for a long time. Didn't know if I'd ever get the chance to give it to you. I opened it. Inside was a photo, me at age 9, in a makeshift aviator costume, goggles crooked, arms spread like wings. Below it, written in her handwriting, was a caption, "Our little pilot." She looked at me, eyes glassy. I should have remembered who you were before the world made you prove it. And just like that, one thread of tension unraveled. That we talked. That day, talked. I told her about the fear I carried, not in war zones, but in living rooms. How silence hurts more than any battlefield. How I waited for years for a simple, "I'm proud of you," that never came. She didn't defend herself. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, and in that moment, I saw not the mother I resented, but a woman who finally saw me not as a disappointment, but a daughter worthy of love without condition. It wasn't a fix. But it was a start. That night, after everyone left, I stood in the backyard alone. The stars above me were bright, unmoving, vast, and ancient. My niece waddled out and gripped my finger. "Aunt Lena," she said, mispronouncing my name, "You fly the sky?" I crouched beside her. "I do. Do you want to fly one day too?" She nodded solemnly, then whispered, "Like a hero." That word hung in the air like a prayer. Hero. To her, I was never forgotten. I was never erased. I was the beginning of her story, and that meant everything. In the months that followed, things changed. Jenna and I began calling regularly, not about the past, but about life, her daughter, my missions. We grew into new versions of ourselves, untethered from the labels we were assigned. As children, my father began introducing me as my daughter, the Air Force officer, with real pride in his voice. Even my mother, always guarded, sent me care packages when I deployed. Letters, photos, the kind of gestures I used to dream about. The scars remained. But scars are proof we survived. And then came the moment that cemented everything. The mayor of our hometown called me with an offer to be the Grand Marshal of the 4th of July parade. Everyone had seen the gala footage, heard the speech. People I hadn't spoken to since high school were suddenly posting about me online. I hesitated at first, but then I thought about the girl who had once left town with a duffel bag and a silent goodbye, who returned wearing stars she never thought her family would see. I said yes. I rode through town in an open-top military jeep. Kids waved flags. People stood in salute. But what struck me most was the sight of my family, front row, waving, clapping, eyes filled with something deeper than approval or recognition. Halfway through the route, I saw Jenna holding her daughter up on her shoulders. There she is, Jenna shouted, and her little voice echoed across the street. That's my hero. And suddenly, it didn't matter that I missed the wedding. I had shown up for something bigger. At the end of the parade, I gave a small speech. I didn't talk about pain, or exclusion, or betrayal. I talked about forgiveness, about the strength that doesn't need to shout, about how we find our way back to each other, not through perfection, but through truth. I ended with this: you may not always be seen, but never let that stop you from showing up. Because one day, the world, and maybe even your own family, will finally see who you were all along. They rose to their feet, and in the crowd, I saw my mother crying. The full circle moments feel like fate correcting itself. But that's not always true. Sometimes, it's not fate, it's you. It's the choices you made, the pain you survived, the silence you broke, the stars you earned. And then one day, without warning, you're standing exactly where they once told you didn't belong, and this time, no one dares to look away. That moment came for me in a way I didn't see coming. It arrived not through family, but through the very venue where my sister's wedding happened. The place I was never invited to. It started with a call from an old high school friend, Mia, who now worked in event planning for that same country club. I hadn't spoken to her in years, maybe a casual Facebook like here and there. She called me out of the blue, her voice bubbling with excitement. Elena, I don't know if you've heard, but the club is celebrating its 75th anniversary, she said. We're planning a Veterans Honor Ball, and your name came up. We'd love for you to be our keynote speaker and guest of honor. I paused. The same ballroom? The one I wasn't good enough for. I almost said no. The old hurt flickered like a match. That place had been part of my worst memory, a shrine to erasure, a monument to my absence. But then something in me stirred. A quiet voice, the same one that had guided me through every mission, every desert sky, every hard-earned rank. Go back. Not for them. For yourself. So I said yes. Not with bitterness. Not with spite, with certainty, and that changed everything. I arrived early that evening, hours before the guests. The staff recognized me instantly, some wide-eyed, others whispering, "Is that her?" I heard one ask, "The 4-star general?" Yes. I was that woman now. I stepped into the empty ballroom. White pillars, crystal chandeliers. The very space I was once excluded from was now being prepared in my honor. My photo stood at the center of the welcome table, me in full uniform, medals lined across my chest, captioned, Major General Elena Ford, hometown hero. No one could erase me now. Amia found me standing at the edge of the stage, she said gently. I was at Jenna's wedding. I remember looking around and wondering where you were. I didn't know what had happened. But I'm so glad you came back here tonight. I smiled. So am I. And I meant it. Because healing isn't just about being included, it's about choosing to stand where you were once made small and realizing you've outgrown the room. That night, the ballroom filled quickly. Dignitaries, community leaders, teachers, veterans, and tucked into the back row, my family. Yes, they came. My parents, Jenna, her husband, my nieces in a sparkling dress. None of them had seen the invitation firsthand. It had come through town channels. But once they heard my name, they didn't stay away, and this time, they weren't sitting at the VIP table. They were witnesses. Just like everyone else, I stepped onto the stage as the applause rose. Not 1 ounce of me shook. I began with a story, not about war or medals, but about coming home. I wasn't always seen, I said. I wasn't always invited. The first time I ever stood in this room, it wasn't for a celebration. It was for redemption. You could hear a pin drop. I looked out at their faces, not just the strangers, but my family. Their eyes locked on mine. I've worn many uniforms. I've faced enemy fire. I've commanded teams. But the hardest thing I've ever done was come back here, to my hometown, and stand as someone I always was, even when no one recognized it. The applause didn't start right away, but when it did, it felt like thunder. After the event, guests formed a line just to speak with me. Old teachers, young girls in ROTC uniforms, veterans who shared stories I understood without words. One girl, no older than 10, stepped forward, trembling. "I want to be like you," she whispered. "But people laugh when I say that." I knelt beside her. "Then let them laugh," I said. "Because they won't laugh forever. One day, they'll stand." She hugged me tight, her tiny arms around my neck. That moment would stay with me longer than any medal. Eventually, my family approached. Not as a group. One by one. My father was first. His back straighter than I remembered, eyes filled with more than pride, humility. "You made this place better just by walking in," he said, and for the first time, I didn't brace for the next sentence. Because there wasn't one. No, but no justification. Just the truth. Next came Jenna. She didn't say anything at first. Just wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "You did it." "I always could," I replied, and she nodded, tears running down her cheeks. Later that evening, as the last guests filtered out, I stood near the doors where I had once never been welcomed. The event coordinator approached with a small black folder. "This is for you," she said, handing it over. Something the board voted on unanimously. Inside was a document officially naming one of the country club's grand rooms, the Ford Room, dedicated to those who rise above silence. I held it in my hands, stunned. My name, in gold, permanently etched in the same building that once treated me like I didn't belong, and now I was part of its legacy. The next morning, I took a long walk through town, past my old high school, the diner where I first told Jenna I was enlisting, the street where my mother once said, "This isn't what I pictured for you." I stopped at the town square, where a new plaque had been installed that week. It listed the names of decorated veterans from our region. At the bottom, it read Major General Elena Ford. Her silence was mistaken. Her strength was not. I traced my fingers across the words, overwhelmed that this town hadn't just welcomed me back. It had honored the parts of me it once ignored. That night, back in my room, I sat alone and opened a journal I hadn't touched in years. The first page was dated 10 years ago, from my first deployment. The handwriting was shaky. Words is unsure. "I hope one day, they understand. And if not, I hope I survive long enough to not care." I smiled, tears sliding silently down my face, because I had survived, and now they understood that there's something sacred about legacy, not the kind etched in medals or awards, but the one carved quietly in how you show up for others. I used to think healing would be loud, public, ceremonial. But real healing? It's quiet. It's in the everyday decisions to show up, strong, grounded, and unshaken. It's in returning not as the girl they excluded, but as the woman they could no longer ignore. And now, as life gently turned its pages forward, I found myself carrying something even greater than redemption, responsibility, because the next generation was watching. It started with an invitation from my niece's school. Jenna called me one evening, hesitant at first. "Lena," she said softly, "Maya's school is doing a real-life heroes assembly. She wrote an essay about you." I blinked. "About me?" "Yes," Jenna said, her voice cracking. "She said she wanted to be strong like her Aunt Elena. She wants her friends to know what courage looks like." I didn't say anything for a long time. My heart was too full. Then I simply asked, "When and where?" I wore my dress uniform, not for applause, but because I wanted those children to see what earned pride looked like. When I walked into that elementary school gym, the room buzzed with energy. Rows of tiny chairs, hand-painted signs, a glitter banner that read, "Everyday Heroes." And there, front row, was Maya, her hair in twin braids, eyes wide, clutching a paper with a big red star drawn on it. When they called my name, the entire gym erupted into claps and cheers. But it was her face, lit with pure joy, that silenced everything else around me. This was what full circle looked like. I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at a sea of young faces, and spoke not as a general, but as a girl who once sat in a school gym just like this, wondering if she'd ever matter. "I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a general," I began. "Some people thought I wouldn't become anything at all." Some of the teachers exchanged glances, but I learned something important. Strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. It's in standing back up when others try to erase you. You could hear the stillness settle in. Even the kids leaned forward. I talked about leadership, about the service, about standing alone sometimes because it's the right thing to do. I told them how I flew missions across oceans, navigated storms, saved lives, and also cried in empty tents where no one knew my name. And then I looked straight at Maya. "You don't have to wait to be chosen," I said. "You can choose yourself." Her eyes filled with tears. So did mine, and when I finished, the gym exploded in applause, but what stayed with me was her tiny voice yelling, "That's my aunt," loud enough for the world to hear. After the assembly, a line of kids formed. Some wanted to salute, some just wanted to hug me. One little girl, no taller than my knee, whispered, "You're the first lady pilot I ever saw in real life." I knelt beside her and said, "Then let's make sure you're not the last." That afternoon, I was asked to stay for a classroom Q&A. Maya's teacher introduced me as a real-life role model who rose through adversity. The questions were innocent and bold. What's the scariest thing you've ever done? Did you ever miss your family? Were you ever told you couldn't do it? Each question was a thread to a deeper truth. And I answered everyone. Later that week, I received over 20 handwritten letters from the students. One said, "Thank you for showing me that girls can be brave." Another said, "I want to fly planes now, too." And from Maya, "Thank you for showing me that it's okay to be different. I love you, Aunt Elena." I wept when I read that, because I realized something profound. The story wasn't just about coming back to the family who erased me. It was about becoming the person who could never be erased again. In the following months, I was invited to speak at universities, community centers, women's shelters, and youth programs. I didn't talk about warfare or tactics. I talked about dignity. I talked about being overlooked. I shared how silence almost broke me, but purpose rebuilt me. One girl, after a seminar, grabbed my hand and said, "My family never believed in me either, but now I see that I don't have to wait for them to." I squeezed her hand and said, "You don't. You only need to believe in yourself." And just like that, she stood a little taller. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family continued to evolve, not perfectly, but honestly. My father called more. He started reading books on women in the military, sending me emails with articles and questions. He even started volunteering at a local veteran center. My mother, for the first time, attended a promotion ceremony. She wore a blue scarf that matched my uniform and introduced herself to my colleagues proudly as Elena's mom. I could still see the remnants of old discomfort in her, like someone walking barefoot on stones, but she was trying, and trying, I've learned, is where healing begins. One day, Jenna and I sat on her porch while Maya napped inside. We watched the sun dip below the trees. "I still think about that wedding," she said quietly. "How I let you slip through the cracks. How we all did." I looked at her. I used to think I'd never stop thinking about it, but now, it's just a dot in a long timeline. She nodded. "You're not angry anymore?" I smiled. "No, because I got something better. I've got to become someone none of you could ignore. Not even me." She reached over and took my hand. "I see you now. All of you." And I believed her. A year later, I received word I was being nominated for a national honor, the Legion of Merit. It was one of the highest awards an officer could receive. At the ceremony, I was asked who I'd like to present me the medal. Without hesitation, I said, "My sister." Jenna froze when I told her. "Are you sure?" she whispered. I nodded. "It matters that it's you." And when she pinned that medal on my chest, tears streaming down her cheeks, I knew we had both reclaimed something we lost long ago, not just each other, but ourselves. They say leadership isn't about commanding attention. It's about lifting others so they rise even when you're gone. I used to think my story ended with redemption, reclaiming my place in the family, standing where I'd once been erased, and proving I belonged. But stories like mine don't end with medals or speeches. They evolve into something deeper. A responsibility to ensure no one else feels like they have to fight to be seen. A few months after receiving the Legion of Merit, I was asked to serve as the Director of Women in Service Initiatives, a new role designed to expand recruitment, mentorship, and visibility for women in the armed forces. It was a prestigious post, yes, but to me, it was personal. For decades, women had slipped through the cracks of recognition and opportunity. Forgotten. Overlooked. Just like I had been. And now I had the power to change that, not with slogans, but with systems. I accepted the position with one goal: to make sure no girl ever had to become invisible to be strong. The work was intense. I traveled across the country, meeting cadets, visiting academies, speaking with commanders. In every city, I met girls with fire in their eyes and doubt in their hearts. Will they take me seriously? Can I lead if I've never seen someone like me do it? Do I have to become hard to survive? And every time, I told them the same thing: you don't have to change who you are to wear the uniform. You just have to remember who you are. Because I had learned that resilience wasn't about erasing softness, it was about defending it. One day, during a training summit, I met a young Air Force pilot named Tamira, 24 years old, top of her class, fierce, brilliant. But when she sat down in my office, she looked like she was about to crumble. "They respect my numbers," she said, "but not my voice." I leaned forward, "Then speak louder." And If they still don't listen, build your runway. She blinked, confused. You don't have to land where they expect you to, I said. You get to chart your course. A few weeks later, she emailed me a photo of her leading her first mission team. She ended the email with, I built the damn runway. Thank you, ma'am. Back at home, my niece Maya was now 7. She had started drawing fighter jets in her school notebooks. Her dolls had call signs. Her bedtime stories were stories I made up about brave women pilots who outflew storms. Jenna once caught her saluting the mirror and asked, "What are you doing?" "I'm practicing," she said proudly, "for when I become Aunt Elena." And, in that moment, I realized our strength echoes through generations we'll never meet. The battles we fight aren't just ours, they become blueprints for others. And Maya? She was already flying higher than I ever dreamed. One autumn morning. As I watched cadets go through field drills at the academy, my assistant handed me a file. Ma'am, this came in from headquarters. I opened it. Inside was a briefing on a proposed mentorship initiative, but stapled behind it was a formal retirement proposal for me. I stared at it for a long time. After decades of service, they were offering me the chance to step down, honorably. With full legacy, full pension, and full ceremony. I was eligible, respected, at peace. But was I ready to stop? That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, a glass of tea beside me. The paperwork is untouched. My dress uniform hangs in the hallway. I stared at the stars outside, the same ones I used to gaze at through a tent flap in the desert, and I asked myself a question no one else could answer. Was my mission complete? Or was there one more flight left? I didn't sleep much that night, because the answer didn't come easily, but when it did, it came like dawn. I didn't retire, not yet. Instead, I did something else. I returned to active command, one final mission. Not because I had to, but because I wanted the next generation to see that strength doesn't retire. It evolves. I led a multinational joint training operation that year. 45 countries, thousands of troops. And I did it with women by my side, officers I had mentored, pilots I had trained. Voices that were once whispers are now speaking with thunder, and for the first time, I felt not just respected. I felt surrounded. When the mission ended and the debriefs were written, I finally stepped back. I retired with full honors that fall. The ceremony was held on the same base where I had once been saluted for the very first time. My family attended, this time with no hesitation. Maya held my hand as we walked onto the parade field. Jenna wept through the entire speech. My father stood and saluted me. My mother placed a hand on my shoulder like she had always known I was meant to lead, but what made me cry was Maya's speech. Yes, she gave one too. She stood on a small stool behind the microphone, her voice tiny but clear. My Aunt Elena is the strongest person I know. Not because she wears stars, but because she made me believe I could too. She pulled a crayon drawing from her pocket. It was a picture of me holding her hand, and flying, not in a jet, with wings. I cried harder than I ever had on a battlefield, because this was a legacy. Not the medals, not the room named after me, but the belief was passed down from one girl to another. After retirement, I moved into a quiet house not far from the base. I began teaching part-time, giving guest lectures, and mentoring young officers. And I finally wrote my story, the full story. The parts people didn't know. The silence. The erasure, the pain, the strength. It became a best-selling memoir. But, more importantly, it became a mirror. Women from all walks of life wrote to me. I thought I was the only one forgotten. I thought I had to become someone else to matter. You helped me come home to myself. And that was worth more than all the medals combined. Final words. I was erased, once told I didn't belong in a place meant to celebrate love and unity. But I came back wearing stars they couldn't deny, not to shame them, not to prove a point, but to show myself, and every girl watching, that our worth is never determined by the invitations we do or don't receive. It's in how we rise after being told we shouldn't. And now, years later, I walk through my days not just as a retired general, but as a woman who became the story they didn't want to tell, and made it unforgettable. Retirement is a strange thing. One day, you're commanding operations, briefing world leaders, navigating jet engines, and geopolitics. The next day, the loudest sound is the tea kettle whistling on a quiet morning. For the first few months, I didn't know what to do with the silence, and yet, I wasn't lonely, because silence now wasn't the emptiness I used to dread. It was earned. It was mine. But just as I was settling into stillness, something unexpected stirred the skies again. It began with a letter, paper, not digital, handwritten in tight, nervous cursive. It came from a girl named Amira in a rural Tennessee town. She wrote, "I found your story online. My school doesn't support girls joining the military. My dad says it's not for women. But when I read what you did, I started training in secret. Please don't think I'm foolish. I just want to become someone like you. Someone who isn't scared to show up. I read that letter a dozen times. Folded it. Unfolded it. Sat in my backyard until dusk fell, thinking about her words. I had never met this girl, but I knew her, because I had once been her. The next week, I wrote Amira back, not just a reply, but a promise. I sent her one of my flight pins. I wrote, "You don't need anyone's permission to believe in yourself. But if you ever feel alone, remember, I've walked this road. And I'm walking with you now." Then I made a call to the Women in Service Foundation and asked to launch a new mentorship scholarship in my name. We called it the Wings program. Our goal, reach 10 girls a year. Provide funding, mentorship, flight training, and, most importantly, a belief system to carry them higher than doubt. The program launched within 6 months. The first girl chosen? Amira. Meeting her in person was like looking into a mirror from 3 decades ago. Same steady eyes. The same fire held behind the quiet the ceremony. I stood beside her in front of a crowd of cadets and said, "We don't build legacies by holding on to our stars. We build them by handing them down, one wing at a time." Amira stood beside me, tears in her eyes, holding her scholarship certificate. She whispered, "I feel seen." And I said the words I once needed so badly. You always were. News of the Wings program spread quickly. Applications poured in. Teachers, single mothers, tribal leaders, immigrant families, they all sent letters with one theme in common. She doesn't see herself in the world right now, but she saw herself in you. And I understood, because I'd spent most of my life becoming the woman I needed when I was younger, and now, I could finally be her for someone else. That was my final mission, and it was only just beginning. A few years into retirement, something happened I never expected. That Jenna's daughter, my niece Maya, turned 18. She didn't go into flight school. She didn't join the Air Force. Instead, she enrolled in international diplomacy, wanting to help prevent the wars I once flew into. Her strength wasn't in jets, it was in words. In building what I had been trained to defend. But before she left for college, she made one request. "Aunt Elena," she said, "I want you to walk me down the aisle one day." I laughed. "You're not even engaged." "I will be. Someday." She grinned. "And when I do, I want you there. In front. Where do you belong?" My heart caught in my chest, because I'd never been anyone's first at a wedding until now. Years passed. Maya grew into a poised, fierce young woman. She traveled the world, interned at the UN, fell in love with a fellow policy researcher named Noel. When they announced their engagement, Maya called me first. "Aunt Elena," she said, crying. "It's happening. You said yes, years ago. Are you still in?" "Yes," I said, with tears already running down my cheeks. "This time, I'll walk through the front doors." The wedding was held at a hillside vineyard overlooking the Pacific. The sun lit the sky like a stage curtain opening for the final act. I wore a navy dress. Simple. Elegant. No medals. No stars, just me. And when the music played and Maya stood at the top of the aisle, bouquet in hand, she reached for my arm. "You were the first person who ever told me I was powerful," she whispered. "And you believed me?" I replied. Together, we walked. I saw my parents in the front row. Older now. Gentler. Their hands were tightly clasped. I saw Jenna, wiping tears, her eyes never leaving me, and I realized something. I hadn't just walked Maya down the aisle, I had walked back into the family, but this time, not as someone hoping to be invited, as someone essential, as someone they never stopped needing. Even when they didn't know it, I never planned to become a symbol, as symbols are distant, polished, impossible to reach. I was just a woman with calloused hands and a spine shaped by silence. But over time, something shifted. As my story traveled through speeches, letters, and those who carried it forward, I began hearing from people I never thought I'd touch, not just girls who dreamed of flying, but mothers, teachers, even men, especially the ones who watched from the sidelines and never knew what to say. One message came from a retired colonel, James Weller. He'd served in my first unit. I remembered him clearly, stern, focused, deeply respected. He emailed me one line, "I owe you an apology. I saw them overlook you." And I said nothing. I stared at that message for a long time. It's one thing to be forgotten. It's another to be remembered by those who once watched you disappear. I wrote back, "You can't rewrite what you witnessed, but you can teach the next one not to repeat it." He replied a day later with a screenshot of a mentorship program he'd launched at his old base. In my name. That's how change works, quietly. One choice at a time. Soon after, I was invited to give a commencement address at the Air Force Academy. Thousands of cadets. Flags rippling like waves. My story had reached farther than I ever intended, and yet, somehow, I was just beginning to understand its meaning. I stood behind the podium, looking at those bright eyes and straight backs, and I said, "You will be challenged, not just by enemies, but by systems, by silence, by moments where doing the right thing will feel lonely. But your duty isn't just to the mission. It's to each other. It's for the forgotten. It's to the ones who never made it to this stage. So don't just lead from the front. Reach back. That standing ovation lasted 4 full minutes, but it was a moment after the speech that gripped me the most. A cadet approached me, small, quiet, barely 5 feet tall. Her voice trembled as she said, "They told me I wouldn't survive boot camp. My brother said I should give up. But when I saw your name on the A Women of Command list, I stayed." I reached for her hand, "Then let them watch you rise." She nodded, eyes burning, and walked away with her head higher than before, and in that moment, I didn't see a cadet, I saw the girl I once was, still rising up. It's funny how life always circles back, not just in places, but in people. Years after the wedding that erased me, and long after the gala that introduced me, my mother asked if I'd speak at her women's book club. I thought she was joking me? A room full of women reading historical fiction and sipping tea? She smiled. "They read your book last month, and they want to hear from the author." I blinked. "Did they read my story?" She nodded. "Every word." "They cried. Some called their daughters after." So I said yes. The room was filled with women of all ages. Some had grandkids. Some still wore grief on their shoulders. Some just wanted to understand their daughters better. I read a chapter aloud, the one about walking into the wedding venue. Years later, not as a guest, but as the guest of honor. When I finished, there was no applause, just silence, and then, one by one, women began to speak. My daughter stopped talking to me after I dismissed her dream. I always told my niece the military wasn't for girls. I never saw what it did to her. I didn't know what silence looked like from the other side. My mother sat quietly the whole time. At the end, she stood up and said, "I almost lost my daughter because I thought strength had to look like me." Then she turned to me, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "But she taught me what real strength is." And in that moment, the stars on my chest meant less than the hand she placed over her heart. Later that night, she handed me something wrapped in tissue paper. "I found this last week, tucked in the attic." I opened it. It was a letter I had written when I was 16. Unsent. Addressed to my parents. "I know I don't fit what you wanted, but I hope one day, you'll see who I've been becoming in silence." My mother looked down. "I never saw this. If I had, I might have said something then." I held her hand. Maybe it was meant for now. Because some letters don't need to be mailed, they just need to be found. That summer, Maya visited me alone for the first time. No wedding. No family. Just a trip between generations. We watched planes take off from the old base runway. She pointed and asked, "Do you ever miss it?" I smiled. Not the noise. Not the wait. But the reason? Yes. I'll always miss the reason. She leaned against my shoulder. "I think I found mine." "What is it?" "To build peace. So others don't have to fight for their place." And I realized, she hadn't just inherited my name, she inherited my purpose. Every generation has its fight. Some raise their voices. Some raise their fists. I raised wings, but the girls I met after retirement? They didn't wait to be given permission. They'd seen what waiting cost people like me. They knocked down doors we were once too scared to open. The Wings program grew beyond anything I imagined. What started as a promise to one girl became a global initiative. Over 300 young women had passed through our training tracks: aviation, engineering, leadership, and defense diplomacy. Some joined the military. Some became aerospace engineers. Some became teachers who taught other girls not to shrink, and once a year, they all came back to what we called the Legacy Weekend. It wasn't a graduation. It was a gathering of stories. One evening, under string lights and desert sky, we sat in a circle with blankets and cocoa in silence that felt sacred. Tamira, the first mentee, stood and held up her flight pin. "I used to think I'd make it if I just pushed harder, smiled more, stayed quiet," she said. "But then I met General Elena. She didn't tell me to change. She told me to take space." She handed her pin to the youngest girl in the program, a 16-year-old from a Navajo reservation named Sky. "I don't need to hold this anymore," Tamira said. "Because now, you will." Sky took the pin with both hands. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. This was legacy in motion. The next morning, I gave them each a letter, not a speech, not a certificate, but a handwritten letter. Inside each envelope was a message only they would read, ending with one line: "You don't need 4 stars to lead. Just one truth you never let go." They cried. I cried, but I knew, watching them walk away toward futures I couldn't even picture, that my mission would outlive me, because I had lit the match, but they would carry the fire. Not long after Legacy Weekend, I sat in my study and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a sealed envelope addressed to my sister. The handwriting was shaky. The paper yields. It was the letter I had written the night after her wedding. I had never sent it. I didn't even remember everything it said, but now, I opened it. Dear Jenna, I don't know if you'll ever understand what this night felt like. I stood on the sidewalk outside your venue. I saw our cousins, the flowers, the music. I saw Dad laugh and Mom wipe a tear from her cheek. I saw you dance with everyone but me, and I thought, maybe I was invisible to you, but one day, if you ever do see me, if you see what I've been building out of the silence, I hope you know. I never stopped loving you, even when I stopped waiting for you to love me back. I sat with that letter for a long time, then I picked up my phone and called her. Jenna? I said, my voice soft. Yeah. I found something I wrote, from a long time ago. She didn't say anything. I didn't send it because I didn't need to. But I'm reading it now, and I want you to know something. What? I let go of that night, but I never let go of you. She exhaled, then whispered, thank you for surviving it, and still coming back. We cried together again, but this time, not from pain, from peace. Years passed. The edges of life softened. The ache in my knee was a little louder. My travel was less frequent, but my joy, my clarity, sharper than ever. I spent mornings reading, afternoons mentoring, and evenings writing stories I'd never had time to tell. Not war stories, not policy reports, just truth stories about the women who never fit the mold, but changed everything. Anyway, one winter, I was invited to give a talk at a private girls' school in Vermont. Nothing flashy, just a library filled with students in plaid skirts and curiosity in their eyes. One girl raised her hand and asked, General Ford, did it all turn out the way you hoped? Asterisk. I smiled, no. It turned out better. She tilted her head. Even with what your family did? I nodded, because if they hadn't erased me, I wouldn't have written the story I did. And that story? It gave 1,000 other girls a beginning. And that's what they don't tell you about erasure. If you survive it, you get to become unforgettable. That night, back in my hotel room, I looked in the mirror, not at my medals, not at my scars, but at the eyes of a woman who didn't wait for justice to be handed to her. She made it, and gave it away, over and over again, until no one around her could pretend they didn't see her anymore. It happened on a spring day, soft light, warm breeze. I was trimming roses in my garden, when the call came. The National Archives wanted to feature my story as a permanent exhibit. Not just my military work, but my whole story. From exclusion to elevation. They were calling it, the star they couldn't erase. I didn't answer right away. I walked to the back fence, watched the wind in the trees, and whispered aloud, they finally saw. But then I shook my head, because the truth was, I saw myself first. The exhibit opened in D.C. 6 months later. Photos, letters, audio interviews, a video loop of Maya's wedding speech. And in the center, my old uniform, not the most decorated one, just the one I wore the day I stood in that ballroom again, not as a guest, but as the reason everyone showed up. Visitors wrote messages on a wall titled, To the Girl They Forgot. Hundreds of notes filled it within days. One read, I see you now. Because of her. And I wept, because I knew this was the final chapter one hadn't needed, but deeply deserved. That there's a moment, late in life, when you realize you're no longer building a legacy, that you've become it. I didn't expect that moment to come in the form of a letter from the Smithsonian Institution. A new exhibit titled, Women Who Shaped the Nation, was being curated. Doctors, astronauts, diplomats, artists, and they wanted to include me, not just for my military service, but for my refusal to disappear. They flew me to D.C. to film an interview. I wore a navy blue suit. No stars. No ribbons. Just Elena. The woman who stood outside her sister's wedding once upon a time chose not to let the door define her. The interviewer, a kind-eyed woman named Professor Jane Elwood, asked, General Ford, when did you first know you were rewriting history? I smiled. When I stopped trying to be invited in, I said, and started building something they'd one day study. She paused, then said, you know, most legacies are written after someone's gone. But yours, people are studying it while you're still breathing. And that's when I realized something extraordinary I had lived long enough to witness. My own impact. The exhibit unveiling, Maya was by my side, now 32, with 2 daughters of her own. She pointed at my photograph, one of me standing on the runway, helmet in hand, face full of grit, and told her oldest, that's your great Aunt Elena. The little girl blinked up at me. You flew airplanes? I did, I smiled. But more than that, I taught others how to fly. She reached out and touched the glass frame where my name was etched in gold. You're famous, she said. No, I whispered, bending down to her level. I'm remembered. That's different. In the quiet of my 60s, I began visiting women's prisons and press. No cameras. No organizations, just me. A woman who had once known what it meant to be overlooked, misjudged, and silenced. These women, too, had stories no one wanted to hear. Some had defended themselves against abusers and been punished. Others had made mistakes they now carried like shadows. But all of them, in some way, had been erased. I sat with them. I listened. I never wore my medals. I didn't want to impress them, I wanted to meet them, and over time, the walls came down. One day, a woman named Dominique shared her story, how she had been in the army once, just like me, until a false accusation ended her career and sent her spiraling into homelessness, then crime, then prison. They erased everything I was, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I leaned forward and gently took her hand. So you rewrite it. You start again. She stared at me like I had handed her a key. From that day on, she wrote every night, poems, letters, essays. By the time she was released, she had written a book titled, In the Silence, I Grew. She dedicated it to me. The world didn't know I was visiting prisons. No headlines, no awards, but in those echoing halls, something sacred happened. Women who had lost their names found a way to reclaim them, not because I saved them, but because I saw them, and sometimes that's all it takes to light a fire that can never be put out again. It was Maya who organized the ceremony. She didn't tell me at first. All she said was, clear your Saturday. Dress formal. I thought it was a family reunion or maybe a small celebration. I didn't suspect anything until we arrived at the state capitol building and I saw the crowds gathered, posters with my name, military women in uniform, teenagers from the Wings program. A banner that read, Welcome home, General Elena Ford. I was stunned. Maya stood on the steps with a microphone in hand and said, many years ago, my aunt stood outside a wedding she wasn't invited to. Today, we stand here, not to celebrate a title or a rank, but to honor the woman who helped all of us find a way back to ourselves. She handed me the mic and for a moment, I was speechless. Then I looked out at all those faces, some I knew, many I didn't, and I said, I once believed that justice came with applause. But I learned that real justice is the moment the people you served no longer need you to prove anything, because they're already standing on what you built. The crowd rose in a standing ovation, but what gripped me most was the sight of Jenna and my parents in the front row, older, softer, changed, and for the first time in my life, my father stepped up to the podium after me and said, with a breaking voice, I once told my daughter that her strength would make her lonely. I was wrong. Her strength built a family. That was the moment I knew I didn't just come full circle. I had redrawn the circle entirely. When I returned home that night, I sat under the stars. No uniform, no stage, no crowd, just me, a soft wind, and the quiet, and I whispered into the night, you erased me once, but I made sure you could never do it again. Because I had become the woman I once needed, and now, she lives in every girl who stands taller. Because I didn't stay small. Not long after the state homecoming, I was invited to speak at the Global Women's Leadership Forum in Geneva. Presidents, scientists, activists, people with voices that echoed across continents. When they called to confirm, they said, you'll be closing the summit, General Ford. I laughed. The last word? Me? The coordinator replied, you earned it. But as I packed for the trip, something lingered in the back of my mind, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years, not pride and not fear, but awe, because this time, the world wasn't asking me to explain who I was, they were listening before I even spoke. The auditorium held thousands. The walls were lined with names I had once read in history books. Now my name was printed right beside them. Before I stepped on stage, I remembered a moment from my 20s, me, standing alone in a dusty airstrip hangar, watching others be chosen while I was told to await my turn. I thought I'd be waiting forever, but now, I wasn't just part of the story, I was writing it. I stood behind the podium. The spotlight warmed my face. The room fell silent, and I said there was a time I stood outside a door that wouldn't open for me. So I built my own. They said I was too quiet, too different, too ambitious, too much of everything that made them uncomfortable. But I didn't stop. Because some of us aren't meant to be included. We're meant to include others. The audience rose, thunderous, unified, and I stood still, not in surprise, but in peace, because I had finally sat at the table I built with my own hands, and the seats beside me? They were already filled with women who now knew they belonged. A few weeks after returning from Geneva, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a small wooden box. Hand-carved, delicate, and tucked beside it was a folded letter. Dear Elena, I've carried this box for decades. It belonged to your grandmother. She wanted you to have it when you turned 30, but, well, the years got away from me. And then I thought you wouldn't care, but now I see what you've done. And I think she would have wanted this to finally reach you. Momi stared at it for hours before opening it. The wood smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Inside were a few keepsakes, an old photo of my grandmother in her World War II uniform, a pair of pearl earrings, and a sealed envelope addressed, "For the girl who makes her sky." It was her handwriting, hands trembling. I opened it. "You don't know me well, but I've watched you from wherever I've gone. And I know what they tried to take from you, but your power was never given. It was born in your bones. Don't forget that. Not even when they do." I pressed the letter to my chest and cried, because even across time, she had seen me, and in that moment, I felt every forgotten woman who had ever flown in silence whispering, "You were never alone." Maya came to visit again in the spring, her youngest now 5, full of questions and laughter. We sat under the old oak in my backyard as the little one twirled in the grass. "You know what she asked me yesterday?" Maya laughed. "She asked if she could be a general like Aunt Elena and a ballerina at the same time." I grinned. "She's already both. She just doesn't know it yet." Maya looked at me, a long pause in her gaze. "You know what else I've been thinking?" she asked. I raised an eyebrow. "I want to write your story, Aunt Elena. All of it." I blinked, "But I already wrote my memoir." She shook her head. "You wrote it as a soldier. I want to write it as a daughter." Tears stung the corners of my eyes. Because that's what she had become, more than a niece. She had filled the place no one else ever stepped into. A witness. A mirror. A legacy. She already had a publisher interested. She wanted to call it, "The General Who Walked Alone," and then led a generation. I nodded. "Then tell them everything. The silence. The fear. The fight. Don't clean it up. Don't make it sweet." "I won't," she promised. "But I will make sure they remember." That night, after they left, I pulled out an old journal I hadn't touched in years. I turned to the first page, dated when I was just 18. "Maybe one day, someone will see what I've been trying to say without words." Now, decades later, I wrote below it, "They did. And they're still listening." Because stories don't end when we do, they begin again. Every time a girl refuses to shrink. It was a cloudy October morning in Colorado when I attended a Women Veterans Appreciation Summit, not as a speaker, just as a guest. I liked it better that way sometimes. You learn more in the back rows than on the stage. I sat with a cup of weak coffee and watched a panel of young leaders talk about inclusion, policy reform, and invisible service. I was proud. I was moved, and then I saw her. A woman is sitting in the third row. She was maybe in her late 50s. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. No name tag. No medals. Just quiet eyes watching the stage with the kind of intensity that tells you she's seen things most people don't survive. There was something familiar in her. At the end of the event, as everyone clapped and filtered toward the exit, I found her standing alone by the coffee station. I walked up, smiled, and said, "First time at something like this?" She chuckled. "You can tell?" I nodded. "I used to linger in corners too." She hesitated, then looked up at me. "You're General Ford, aren't you?" "I am." She looked away for a second, then back again. "I was discharged 20 years ago. Not honorably. Not fairly. I stopped showing up to places like this because I thought the shame belonged to me." I gently placed my hand on her shoulder. "It never did," I said. "And the fact that you're here now means you've already reclaimed your place." Her eyes welled up. And she whispered, "I needed to hear that. Today of all days." We spoke for another hour. Her name was Serena. Her story was brutal. Misconduct by a superior officer, followed by years of silence and lost opportunity. But she was writing now. Working at a shelter for veterans. Taking steps forward. Before we parted ways, she reached into her bag and handed me a folded note. "I brought this in case I saw you. I wasn't sure I would, but I wanted to thank you for proving we don't have to stay forgotten." When I read it later that night, I cried, not for her pain, but for the quiet fire that kept her walking through it. Because we are never just who we are in uniform, but we are who we choose to lift. When the world looks away, the years grew slower, as they tend to do. My knees ached a little more. My pace softened. But my fire? It never dimmed. One morning, I received a call from an old pilot friend, Commander Teresa T. Navarro. We'd flown together once, briefly, during a tense deployment overseas. She was now leading a new aviation program for girls of color. Across the Southwest, she asked, "You up for one more flight?" I laughed. "You want me back in a cockpit?" "No," she said. "But I want you in the jump seat. One last ride." As the girls watched from the ground, we scheduled the flight. For spring, I arrived at the airfield in my standard Navy jacket, no stars, no rank. Just my name embroidered above the heart. A crowd of teenage girls stood behind the safety line, eyes wide, watching the jet warm up. When I stepped onto the tarmac, they gasped, "That's her." One girl whispered, "She's the one who was." I raced, and rewrote everything. I turned, smiled, and waved, and in that moment, I realized I didn't just reclaim my story, I became a chapter in theirs. We took off just past 10 a.m. The sky was clear, blue as a memory. As we lifted, I thought about all the flights before, when I was uncertain, unseen, unwilling to give up, and now I soared not because I needed to prove anything, but because I had already done what I came here to do, and it was beautiful. They held it quietly and no press. No speeches. Just family, friends, and girls from the Wings program gathered at Memorial Garden outside the Air Force Academy. Beneath a plaque I hadn't known they'd made Elena Ford leader, builder, legacy in motion. She flew alone until others learned to follow her. Jenna was there. So was Maya. My parents had long passed, but I felt them in the breeze. Maya placed her hand on the plaque and read it aloud to her daughters. Then she turned to the crowd and said she didn't ask for justice. She built it. She didn't wait for recognition. She earned it without needing applause. And when our family forgot her, she became unforgettable to the world. They opened a memory capsule beside the plaque. Inside were letters from women I had mentored, served, spoken to, or simply stood beside when they needed someone to believe in them. Every one of them had written a note, and everyone began the same way, because of Elena, I. As the sun lowered, the girls lit candles, one for every year I served, one for every girl who'd rise after me, and though I wasn't there in person, I was there in every hand, held every name remembered, every story passed down like armor, because this was never just about being erased from a wedding. It was about showing the world, if you walk through the fire they built to burn you, you'll light the way for those behind you.